The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, a frontier town that had seen better days. The drought of '73 had broken more than just the land, it had broken spirits, emptied purses, and driven desperate families to measures they'd never imagined. Sarah Ann O'Connell stood on the makeshift platform outside the general store, her worn calico dress hanging loose on her too-thin frame, trying not to meet the eyes of the gathering crowd. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Weatherby, cleared his throat nervously. Even he seemed uncomfortable with what was about to transpire, though not uncomfortable enough to refuse his commission. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "we commence this morning with the arranged marriages auction." Sarah's hands trembled as she clasped them in front of her. She could see her parents at the edge of the crowd, her mother weeping silently into a threadbare handkerchief, her father standing rigid, jaw clenched, staring at some fixed point beyond the buildings. Patrick O'Connell had been a proud man once, before the crops failed 3 years running, before the bank took the farm, before they'd been reduced to living in a single room behind the livery stable. "Miss Sarah Ann O'Connell," Weatherby announced. "Age 19 years, of good Irish stock, can read and write, knows her numbers, experienced in all manner of household duties. The family seeks," he paused, consulting his ledger, "$40 to cover debts and passage for the remaining family members to California." $40, the price of her father's pride, her mother's heartbreak, and her own future. The crowd stirred. Most were townspeople come to gawk at the spectacle of their neighbor's misfortune, but among them stood a handful of men prospectors, homesteaders, mountain men who had come with purpose. Sarah forced herself to look at them, these strangers who would decide her fate. $30, called out a voice. Sarah's gaze found the speaker a shopkeeper from the neighboring town, known for working his wife into an early grave. $35, another voice, this from a gray-bearded miner whose breath she could smell from 10 feet away. $40. The bid came from the back of the crowd, deep and certain. The gathering parted as the speaker stepped forward, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and several inches, with shoulders that seemed to strain against his buckskin jacket. His face was weathered like old leather, with lines carved deep by wind and sun. Dark hair, streaked with premature gray, hung to his shoulders, but it was his eyes that held her gray as winter storm clouds, cold and assessing. Ezekiel Boone. She'd heard whispers of him in town, the mountain man who came down twice a year for supplies, who lived alone in a cabin somewhere high in the Rockies. They said he'd lost his wife and child to cholera 5 years back. That grief had driven him to seek solitude in the wilderness. $40, Weatherby repeated, seeming eager to conclude the business. "Do I hear 45? Silence stretched across the square. The shopkeeper shuffled his feet but said nothing. The miner spat tobacco juice and turned away. "Sold to Mr. Boone for $40. The word "sold" rang in Sarah's ears like a death knell. This was truly happening. She was being sold like livestock, like a piece of furniture, to a man who looked as if he'd forgotten how to smile. Boone approached the platform with measured steps, his boots raising small clouds of dust. He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch, counting out the payment in gold coins, not paper money or promises actual gold. He handed it to Weatherby without a word, then turned his storm-gray eyes to Sarah. "Get your things," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "We leave within the hour." Sarah climbed down from the platform on unsteady legs. Her mother rushed forward, embracing her with desperate strength. "My darling girl," she sobbed. "My sweet Sarah Ann, may the Blessed Virgin protect you." Her father approached more slowly, his face a mask of controlled anguish. He pressed something into her hand, her grandmother's rosary, brought from Ireland decades ago. "You're an O'Connell," he said quietly. "Remember that. Remember who you are." "Papa," she began, but he turned away, unable to bear another moment. Sarah had few possessions to gather. Her other dress, patched and mended countless times. Her mother's small Bible, its pages worn soft as cloth, a hairbrush, a small sewing kit, a photograph of her family taken in better times. Everything fit into a single canvas bag. When she emerged from their room behind the livery, Boone was waiting with a wagon and team of oxen. His own horse, a massive black gelding, was tied to the back. He took her bag without comment and placed it in the wagon bed alongside sacks of flour, coffee, salt, and other supplies. "You know how to handle a team?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Then you'll drive. I don't ride in wagons." He helped her up to the seat. His hands were careful, impersonal, then mounted his horse as they prepared to leave. Sarah's mother ran forward one last time. "Please," she begged Boone. "Please be kind to her. She's a good girl, innocent and pure. She's never known a man's touch. Never—" "Madam," Boone cut her off, his voice as cold as mountain snow. "I bought her for one purpose, only to bear my children and continue my line. Whether she cries or not makes no difference to me. Only my heirs matter." The brutality of the words struck like a physical blow. Sarah's mother stumbled back, her face draining of color. Sarah herself felt something die inside her chest, some last flicker of hope that this might not be as terrible as she feared. "Move out," Boone commanded, and Sarah, numb with shock, flicked the reins. As the wagon rolled down Main Street, she kept her eyes forward, though she could feel the weight of the town's gaze. Some faces showed pity, others relief that it wasn't their daughter on that wagon seat. The younger children, not understanding, waved as if she were going on an adventure. At the edge of town, she allowed herself one look back. Her parents stood where she'd left them, growing smaller with each turn of the wheels. Her mother had collapsed against her father, who held her with arms that shook. They would use the $40 to go west, to start over in California where no one knew their shame. She would never see them again. Beside the wagon, Ezekiel Boone rode in silence, his face giving away nothing of his thoughts. He'd bought her as casually as he'd bought the flour and coffee, just another necessity for his isolated life. A woman to work, to breed, to give him the heirs his first wife hadn't lived long enough to provide. Sarah gripped the reins tighter, feeling the leather cut into her palms. Tears threatened, burning hot behind her eyes. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. He'd made it clear her feelings meant nothing. She was property now, bought and paid for, and tears wouldn't change that. The road stretched ahead, leading away from everything she'd known toward the mountains that rose like prison walls against the sky. Somewhere up there waited a cabin, a life of isolation, and a man who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. But as Cedar Falls disappeared behind them and the wilderness closed in, Sarah made herself a promise. She might be bought, but she wouldn't be broken. She was still Sarah Ann O'Connell, and somewhere beneath the fear and despair, a small flame of defiance began to burn. The journey to her new life had begun. The wagon wheels creaked a mournful rhythm as they left the last traces of civilization behind. Sarah kept her back straight, eyes fixed on the rumps of the oxen, trying not to think about the vastness opening before them. The road, such as it was, dwindled from packed earth to twin ruts carved by countless wagons, then to barely a trail marked by bent grass and broken branches. Ezekiel Boone rode ahead, his broad back swaying slightly with his horse's gait. He hadn't spoken since they'd left town, hadn't even looked back to see if she followed. The black gelding picked its way with sure feet, clearly familiar with this journey. By noon, the sun beat down mercilessly. Sarah's bonnet provided little relief, and sweat trickled down her spine, making her dress stick uncomfortably. Her throat was parched, but she didn't dare ask to stop. The canteen hung from the wagon seat, but reaching for it seemed like an admission of weakness she wasn't ready to make. The landscape changed gradually. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and scrub pine. In the distance, the mountains loomed larger, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer heat. Sarah had never been this far from town, never seen country so wild and empty. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like something that could swallow you whole without noticing. When the sun reached its zenith, Boone finally raised his hand, signaling a stop near a small creek. He dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse to water. Sarah climbed down stiffly, her muscles already aching from the constant jolting. "Water the oxen," he said without looking at her. "We'll rest here an hour." She unhitched the team and led them to the creek, grateful for the chance to splash cool water on her face and neck. From her bag, she retrieved the cornbread and dried meat her mother had packed, a final act of love. She ate mechanically, watching Boone from the corner of her eye as he tended his horse, checked his rifle, studied the sky. "Storm coming," he said suddenly, making her jump. "We'll need to make the first way station before it hits." Sarah looked at the sky, seeing only a few wispy clouds, but within an hour, she understood. Dark clouds massed on the horizon, racing toward them with unnatural speed. The wind picked up, whipping her skirts and making the oxen nervous. "Move them faster," Boone commanded, riding back to check their progress. "We've got maybe 2 hours." She urged the team on, but oxen would only move so fast. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they crested a ridge. Below, Sarah could make out a small structure barely more than a glorified shed with a corral attached. By the time they reached it, the storm had unleashed its fury. Rain fell in sheets, turning the trail to mud. Thunder crashed overhead, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. Boone quickly herded the animals into the corral, while Sarah struggled to secure the wagon's canvas cover over their supplies. The way station was crude but solid, built of logs chinked with mud. Inside, it smelled of smoke, old sweat, and something wild. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn benches lined the others. Boone entered behind her, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Get a fire going," he ordered, dropping their gear by the door. "I'll see to the animals." Sarah had built countless fires in her life, but her hands shook as she arranged kindling in the fireplace, whether from cold, exhaustion, or the growing reality of her situation. She couldn't say. By the time Boone returned, she had a small blaze crackling. He shed his wet coat, hanging it on a peg. In the firelight, she could see him more clearly than she had all day. The lines in his face seemed deeper, the gray in his hair more pronounced. But there was strength in him too, a kind of coiled readiness that spoke of years surviving in harsh places. From his pack, he produced coffee, beans, and salt pork. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Yes." "Then do it." She prepared a simple meal while the storm raged outside. They ate in silence, sitting on opposite benches. The fire crackled. Rain hammered the roof. Thunder rolled across the mountains like God's own fury. When darkness fell completely, Boone spread his bedroll near the fire. He tossed a bundle to Sarah, a moth-eaten blanket that smelled of horse. "We leave at first light," he said, stretching out fully clothed, his rifle within easy reach. Sarah made her own bed on the opposite side of the fire. Using her bag as a pillow, she lay awake for hours, listening to the storm, the pop of the fire, the steady breathing of the man who owned her now. Every sound outside made her tense, the howl of wind that might be wolves, the creak of wood that could be footsteps. "They won't come in," Boone's voice came from the darkness. "The wolves, they smell human habitation and stay clear. Bears neither, this time of year." She hadn't realized he was awake, hadn't known she'd made any sound. I've never slept outside before, not like this." "You'll get used to it, or you won't." His tone suggested both outcomes were equally acceptable to him. "How far to where we're going?" 3 days if the weather holds, 4 if it doesn't. And it's just wilderness all the way. God's country, he said, and she thought she heard something in his voice, not quite softness, but perhaps appreciation. No people, no towns, no civilization to corrupt and disappoint. The bitterness in that last statement hung between them like smoke. Sarah pulled the rough blanket higher, trying not to think about what had driven him to seek such isolation, what disappointments had carved those lines in his face. "Mr. Boone," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, only that the silence was too heavy. "Sleep," he cut her off. "Tomorrow will be harder than today." She closed her eyes, though sleep seemed impossible. Outside, something howled wolf or wind. She couldn't tell. The fire was already dying to embers, and cold seeped through the gaps in the logs. This was only the first night. 3 more days of travel, then a lifetime in a place even more remote than this. Tears came then, silent and hot. She turned her face to the wall so he wouldn't see, though the darkness probably hid them anyway. She thought of her mother's warm kitchen, her father's laugh before the troubles came, her little brother who'd died of fever 2 winters past. All gone now, traded for $40 and her family's chance at a new life. But she was alive. She was fed. She had shelter from the storm. It was more than many had in these hard times. And tomorrow she would be stronger. She had to be. The storm began to ease near dawn. Sarah dozed fitfully, waking to find Boone already up, feeding the fire and heating coffee. He handed her a cup without words, and she wrapped her cold fingers around it gratefully. They left the way station as the sun painted the mountains pink and gold. The trail was muddy but passable, and the storm-washed air was crystal clear. Sarah could see for miles endless forest, towering peaks, and not a single sign of human habitation. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. Boone glanced back at her, something like surprise flickering across his weathered features. "It is," he agreed after a moment. "Beautiful and terrible. It'll kill you without a thought if you don't respect it." Like you, Sarah thought but didn't say. Beautiful and terrible and dangerous if not handled right. The second day's journey took them higher into the mountains, the trail narrowing until the wagon barely fit between the trees. They stopped that night in a natural shelter formed by overhanging rocks, and Sarah learned to bank a fire to last through the cold mountain night. She learned, too, that Boone, for all his coldness, would share his knowledge if she asked the right way, not pleading or demanding. Just practical questions about survival. By the 3rd day, her soft hands were blistered from the rains. Her back ached constantly, and her dress was stained with mud and soot. But she hadn't complained, hadn't cried where he could see, hadn't given him any reason to regret his purchase beyond what he already might. The trail they followed was barely visible now, just a faint thread through the wilderness that only Boone's experienced eye could detect. Sarah found herself watching him, learning to read the subtle signs he followed a blazed tree here, a particular formation of rocks there, the way the creek bent just so. The cabin appeared just as the sun touched the western peaks, emerging from the forest like something grown from the earth itself. Sarah's first thought was that it looked more fortress than home solid log walls. Few windows, heavy shutters that could be barred from inside. The roof was thick with sod, wild flowers blooming incongruously amid the grass. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney, suggesting someone had been here recently to prepare for their arrival. "Whoa!" she called to the oxen, bringing the wagon to a stop in the cleared yard. Her voice came out as a croak after hours of silence. Ezekiel dismounted, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man returning to his true home. The clearing was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 2 acres with a vegetable garden fenced against deer, a chicken coop, a substantial barn, and what looked like a smokehouse. Wood was stacked in neat rows along the cabin's wall, reaching nearly to the eaves. Everything spoke of careful planning, hard work, and the determination to be self-sufficient. "Jacob," Boone called out. "Show yourself, boy." A young man emerged from the barn, Native American by his features, perhaps 17 or 18 years old. He moved with easy grace, clearly comfortable here. "Mr. Boone," he said, nodding respectfully. His dark eyes flicked to Sarah with curiosity but no surprise. "Everything's ready like you asked. Caught 2 rabbits yesterday. They're in the pot." "Good. This is my wife, Sarah. Sarah. This is Jacob Two Rivers. His family camps nearby in summer. He helps with the place when I'm gone." Wife? The word hit her like cold water. Not woman, not bride, wife. As if the transaction in town had made it so. "Ma'am," Jacob said politely, touching his hat brim. "Hello," Sarah managed, climbing down from the wagon on unsteady legs. "Help unload," Boone instructed Jacob. "Then you can go. I'll send word when I need you again." They worked in efficient silence, carrying supplies into the cabin. Sarah followed with her small bag, pausing at the threshold. The interior was dim, lit only by the fire and what light filtered through oiled paper windows. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it was surprisingly well appointed for a wilderness home. The main room served multiple purposes: kitchen, dining, and living space, all in one. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with iron pots and skillets hanging nearby. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes, preserves, books. She hadn't expected those. A ladder led to what must be a loft space above. "Your things go up there," Boone said, following her gaze. "The loft is yours." She climbed carefully, finding a small space with a straw mattress, a wooden chest, and pegs for hanging clothes. A tiny window looked out over the forest. It wasn't much, but it was private, and after days of sleeping in the open, it felt almost luxurious. When she descended, Jacob had gone and Boone was checking the rabbit stew. The domesticity of the scene struck her as almost absurd, this hard, dangerous man stirring a pot like any housewife. "Can you make bread?" he asked without turning. "Yes, if there's flour and starter." Crock by the window, flour in the barrel. She found the sourdough starter, fed and bubbling. Someone Jacob had been maintaining it. As she mixed and kneaded the dough, Boone moved around the cabin, checking supplies, testing the shutters, examining his rifles. Everything had a place, she noticed. Everything was ordered, prepared, ready. They ate the simple meal in silence, sitting across from each other at the rough table. The rabbit was tender, flavored with wild herbs. Her bread was passable, though not as good as her mother's. Boone ate methodically, his manners rough but not offensive. When they finished, he pushed back from the table. "I'll show you what you need to know." The tour was businesslike. The root cellar, dug into the hillside and lined with stones, kept vegetables and preserves cool year-round. The smokehouse held venison, bear meat, and fish. The barn sheltered 2 milk cows, several chickens, and feed for the animals. A spring bubbled up near the cabin, providing fresh water that collected in a stone basin. "The garden needs daily tending," he explained. "Cows milked morning and evening, chickens fed, eggs collected. In fall, we'll put up preserves for winter. In winter," he paused, looking at the mountains surrounding them. "In winter, we survive." "What about neighbors? Is there anyone?" "Jacob's family, the Ute, camp about 5 miles north in summer, move south in winter. There's a trapper. Old Pete has a place 2 valleys over. Might see him once, twice a year." He fixed her with those storm-gray eyes. "This is what you need to understand. There's no one else. No town for 50 miles. No doctor. No law but what we make. You get hurt bad. You die. You get lost. You die. You cross the wrong animal. You die." Sarah swallowed hard. "I understand. Do you?" He stepped closer, and she could smell wood smoke and leather on him. "Come first snow. We might not see another soul for 5 months. Just you and me and whatever's in that root cellar. Can you handle that?" "I'll have to, won't I?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise approval, but it was gone before she could name it. "Yes," he said simply. "You will." As darkness fell, the mountain cold crept in despite the fire. Sarah noticed Boone had his own space, a curtained alcove off the main room with a proper bed. She was grateful for the separation, for the loft that would give her some privacy in this forced intimacy. She prepared for bed slowly, listening to Boone moving around below. The unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness pressed in an owl's hunt, the rustle of unknown creatures, the creak of trees in the wind. In her loft, she knelt on the rough boards and pulled out her mother's Bible and grandmother's rosary. The familiar words of evening prayer brought some comfort, though God seemed very far away in this wild place. She prayed for her parents, for strength, for wisdom to navigate this new life. She prayed too for the man below, that whatever hardness life had carved into him might soften, that she might find some kindness in him. A sound made her pause footsteps on the ladder. Her heart raced, her hands clutching the rosary. But Boone's head appeared only briefly. "Forgot to say, bar the shutters at night. Always. Bears get curious sometimes." He paused, noticing the Bible and rosary. "You're religious." It wasn't a question, and his tone was unreadable. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "Is that permitted?" "Pray all you want," he said with a shrug. "Just remember, God's not coming to help with the chores." He descended without another word. Sarah sat in the gathering darkness, candle flickering, and wondered what had happened to make him so bitter about faith. The photograph he'd shown her in town, the woman and child, suggested losses that might challenge anyone's belief. She barred the shutters as instructed, noting the heavy wooden beam that fit into brackets, the iron hinges that looked strong enough to withstand considerable force. Everything here was built to last, built to protect, a fortress. She'd thought when she first saw it. Now she wondered, was it meant to keep dangers out, or to keep something in? In her narrow bed, covered with a quilt that smelled of cedar, Sarah lay awake listening to the night sounds of her new home. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled lonely, mournful. The sound seemed to echo something in her own heart. This was her life now, this cabin, this man, this wilderness that pressed in on all sides. No escape, no alternatives, no hope of rescue. She was as truly bought and owned as any slave, even if the law might say otherwise. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, Sarah remembered the books on the shelves, the garden growing despite the wilderness, the flowers blooming on the sod roof. Life persisted here, even thrived. Perhaps she could too. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning the rhythms of this isolated life, finding her place in Boone's ordered existence, discovering who she could be in a world stripped of everything familiar. But tonight, she was alive, sheltered, fed. For now, that was enough. The candle guttered and died. In the darkness, Sarah clutched her rosary and whispered one last prayer, not for deliverance, but for the strength to endure, to adapt, perhaps even to find some measure of peace in this beautiful, terrible place that was now her home. Winter arrived early that year, catching even Ezekiel off guard. The first snow fell in late September, transforming the mountains into a white wilderness overnight. Sarah woke to a strange brightness filtering through her small window, and a silence so complete it seemed the world had stopped breathing. "Get up!" Boone's voice carried from below. "Snow's come. Everything changes now." She descended to find him already dressed in heavy furs, checking his rifle. The cabin was cold despite the banked fire, and she could see her breath in the air. "The animals," she said, sudden concern flooding through her. "Already fed, but we'll need to move them to the barn's inner stalls. This is just the beginning." Over the following days, Sarah learned what Boone meant by everything changes. The easy rhythm of summer and fall vanished beneath winter's harsh demands. Every morning began the same breaking ice on the water basin, building up the fire until the cabin's chill retreated. Checking that snow hadn't blocked the chimney overnight, the animals required constant attention: fresh straw, unfrozen water, carefully rationed feed that had to last until spring. The world shrank to the clearing and its immediate surroundings. Beyond that, the forest became a maze of white, where every tree looked the same and a wrong turn meant death. Boone showed her the landmarks: the lightning-struck pine, the rock formation that looked like a bear's head, the way certain trees grew along the creek bed, but warned her never to venture out alone. "People think freezing's the danger," he said one morning, stringing rope between the cabin and barn. "It's not. It's getting turned around, walking in circles till you drop. This rope might be the only way to find the barn come a real blizzard." The isolation was complete now. No Jacob stopping by with news from his family. No possibility of the rare trapper or traveler. They were as alone as two people could be, bound together by necessity and the need to survive. Sarah threw herself into work partly from duty, partly to exhaust herself enough to sleep. She learned to stretch their supplies, making soup from bones she would have discarded before, saving every scrap of fat for candles and cooking. She mended and remended their clothes until the patches had patches. When the cow's milk production dropped, she learned to make do with less. But the hardest part wasn't the work or the cold. It was the silence. Boone could go days speaking only in single-word responses or gestures. He spent hours maintaining his equipment, reading one of his few books by firelight, or simply staring into the flames with an expression that discouraged conversation. One evening in November, as snow fell steadily outside, Sarah couldn't bear it anymore. "What do you think about?" she asked. "When you sit there so quiet." He looked up, seeming surprised she'd spoken. "Nothing you'd want to hear." "Try me. The silence is—" She searched for words that wouldn't sound like complaint. "It's heavy." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I think about the trap lines that need checking, whether the roof will hold if we get a heavy snow load, if the meat in the smokehouse will last." A pause. "Sometimes I think about before. Your wife." His jaw tightened. "Mary, yes." "What was she like?" "Why do you want to know?" Sarah considered her words carefully. "Because I live in her shadow. Everything here, the garden planted just so, the curtains on the windows, even the way the dishes are arranged, it all speaks of her. But I don't know if I'm doing things wrong, if I'm disturbing what should be kept the same." Boone set down the knife he'd been sharpening. For a moment, his face lost some of its hardness. "She was small, smaller than you, but strong, came from farming stock back in Ohio. Knew how to work." His voice grew distant. "She made this place feel less like a prison. Sang while she worked. Hymns, mostly, but sometimes other things. The cabin felt warmer when she was in it." "And your child?" "Elizabeth. Lizzie." The name came out rough, like it hurt to say. 3 years old. Hair like corn silk, afraid of nothing, used to chase the chickens till they near died of exhaustion." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, then vanished. "The fever took them both in 2 days. Nothing I could do. No doctor to fetch. Just watch them burn up and fade away." The pain in his voice was raw, immediate, though it had been 5 years. Sarah understood now why he'd sought such complete isolation, why he held himself so apart. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't want your pity." The hardness returned to his voice. "Just need sons to carry on the name, work this land, that's all." But that night, he left something on the table for her, a small wooden box. Inside, she found Mary's sewing kit, with needles far better than her own, colorful threads, and a silver thimble engraved with flowers. "Shame to let it go to waste," he said gruffly when she thanked him, then retreated to his alcove. December brought blizzards that lasted days. The world disappeared entirely, no sky, no mountains, just a wall of white. The wind howled like a living thing, seeking cracks in the walls, piling snow to the eaves. They were trapped inside together, the cabin becoming smaller with each passing hour. It was during one such storm that Sarah discovered the box. She was searching for more mending to occupy her hands when she noticed a loose board in the loft wall. Behind it was a small wooden box, carefully hidden. She knew she shouldn't look, but curiosity won. Inside were photographs, letters, and a child's rag doll. The photographs showed Boone younger, smiling, with a pretty woman and golden-haired child. The letters were from Mary to her sister back east, never sent. Sarah read one before shame stopped her. "Dearest Catherine, the loneliness is the hardest part. Ezekiel is a good man but hard, made harder by this place. Sometimes I fear we'll both turn to stone here, frozen like the mountains. But then Lizzie laughs and the sun breaks through, and I remember why we came for freedom, for land of our own, for a future. I pray someday this wilderness will soften him again. Let him be the man I married. Your loving sister, Mary." Sarah carefully replaced everything, but the words haunted her. Mary had felt it too, the weight of Boone's silence, the way the isolation pressed in. But she'd had hope, had believed in change. That night, as the blizzard raged, Sarah made a decision. She would not turn to stone. She would not let the silence bury her. When Boone sat by the fire after supper, she brought down her Bible. "Would you mind if I read aloud?" she asked. "My mother used to, on winter nights." He glanced up, frowning. "Don't hold with much Bible talk anymore." "Then perhaps something else." She went to his small shelf of books. "What's this one?" "Robinson Crusoe." His frown deepened. "You can read such things." "My father believed in education, even for daughters." She opened the book. Chapter 1. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York. He didn't tell her to stop. As she read, she stole glances at him. The rigid set of his shoulders eased slightly. When she finished the chapter, he was still listening. "Tomorrow night, if you like," she offered. "If you've nothing better to do," he said, but she heard something in his voice, not quite warmth, but perhaps the memory of it. The storms continued through January. Food stores that had seemed abundant in fall dwindled alarmingly. Boone ventured out between blizzards to check trap lines, returning sometimes with rabbit or ptarmigan, sometimes empty-handed. The cold was brutal, seeping through every crack, making the simplest tasks an ordeal. But something had shifted with the reading. Each night after supper, Sarah would read sometimes Crusoe, sometimes the poetry collection she found, occasionally the Bible when Boone seemed receptive. He never asked her to continue, but he never told her to stop either. Sometimes he would even comment on the story, or share a memory it triggered. One night in late January, as she read about Crusoe's loneliness on his island, Boone spoke unexpectedly. "That's what it feels like, the isolation. Like you're the last person on earth, forgotten by God and man alike." "But Crusoe survived," Sarah said carefully. "He made a life." "With Friday, he had Friday eventually." "Yes," she agreed, understanding what he couldn't quite say. He wasn't alone forever. Their eyes met across the firelit space, and something passed between them, not affection exactly, but recognition. They were both survivors of a sort, both castaways in this mountain wilderness, bound by necessity if nothing else. The worst storm came in February, 5 days of howling wind and snow so thick they couldn't see the barn even with a rope. They rationed food carefully, melted snow for water, kept the fire going constantly. On the 3rd day, they heard a terrible crash, a tree falling, taking part of the barn roof with it. "The animals?" Sarah gasped. Boone was already reaching for his coat. "Stay here. You can't go out in this." "Have to." He wrapped rope around his waist. "If I'm not back in an hour, don't come looking." The hours stretched like eternity. Sarah paced the cabin, peering uselessly through the frosted window. Seeing nothing but white, the rope tied to the porch rail stayed taut, then suddenly went slack. Her heart lurched. Had it broken? Had he untied it, or worse, had something happened to him? She waited another 10 minutes, then could bear it no longer. Wrapping herself in every piece of warm clothing she could find, she ventured onto the porch. The wind hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath, driving ice crystals into every exposed inch of skin. "Ezekiel!" she shouted, but the storm swallowed her voice instantly. Following the rope, she fought through drifts that reached her waist. The barn loomed suddenly out of the white half its roof caved in, snow pouring through the gap. She could hear the animals' distressed lowing, but no human sound. Inside, she found chaos. The cows had broken free of their stalls in panic, milling in the undamaged section. Chickens fluttered frantically in their coop, and there, beneath a fallen beam, lay Boone. "No," Sarah dropped beside him. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, stark against the snow. He was unconscious, but breathing. The beam was massive, far too heavy for her to lift. But as she looked closer, she realized it had lodged against the wall, creating a small space that had saved him from being crushed. She could possibly drag him out if she was careful. "Please," she whispered, whether to God or Boone or herself. She wasn't sure. "Please." Inch by agonizing inch, she pulled him free. He groaned once but didn't wake. The journey back to the cabin was a nightmare, dragging his dead weight through the snow, following the rope with hands so numb she could barely grip it, the storm trying to tear them both away. Somehow, she got him inside. Her muscles screamed as she hauled him near the fire, stripping off his wet outer clothes with shaking fingers. The head wound was ugly, but not as deep as she'd feared. She cleaned it with melted snow, bound it with strips torn from her petticoat. "Wake up," she commanded, chafing his cold hands. "You don't get to leave me alone here. Wake up." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Mary?" The name hit her like a slap, but she pushed the feeling aside. "It's Sarah. You're hurt, but you're safe. Can you hear me?" Recognition slowly dawned in his gray eyes. "The barn is damaged but standing. The animals are alive. Don't try to move." "Dizzy," he admitted, which scared her more than the blood had. Ezekiel Boone admitting weakness was unprecedented. For 3 days, their roles reversed. Sarah tended him, forcing broth between his lips when he tried to refuse, changing his bandages, keeping the fire high. She ventured to the barn alone, learning through desperate necessity how to shore up the temporary repairs he'd started, how to calm the spooked animals, how to ration their feed even more strictly. On the second night, fever took hold. Boone tossed restlessly, muttering names: Mary, Lizzie, others she didn't recognize. Once, he grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Don't leave," he said urgently. "Everyone leaves." "I'm here," she soothed. "I'm not going anywhere." Said that before. They all said that. She stayed beside him through the night, cooling his fever with snowmelt, praying when he grew quiet, talking to him when he grew agitated. Somewhere in those long hours, her fear transformed into something else: determination, perhaps, or maybe the first stirrings of genuine care for this difficult, damaged man. By the 4th day, the storm had blown itself out and Boone's fever broke. He woke clear-headed but weak, finding Sarah asleep in the chair beside him, still holding his hand. He studied her face, the exhaustion evident even in sleep, the chapped lips and wind-burned cheeks that spoke of her battles with the storm. When she woke, he said simply, "You saved my life." "You would have done the same," she replied, uncomfortable with his steady gaze. "No," he said. "I mean it. Another woman would have let me die, would have been free." The thought had never occurred to her, and the shock must have shown on her face. "But you didn't," he continued. "Why?" Sarah considered the question. Why indeed she could have been free, the storm would have covered any sign. She could have made it to spring, found her way to civilization, claimed widowhood. "Because," she said finally, "I'm not built for that kind of freedom, the kind that comes from letting someone die." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, perhaps, or recognition. "Thank you," he said, the words rusty from disuse. Recovery was slow. The head injury had affected his balance, making him frustrated and short-tempered, but it also made him dependent on her in a way that changed their dynamic. She helped him to the barn, steadied him when dizziness struck, took on tasks that had been solely his domain. One evening, as she struggled to repair a harness, he guided her hands. "Here, like this. The leather's got to lay flat or it'll rub the horse raw." His hands over hers were gentle, patient. When she mastered the technique, he nodded approval. "You learn quick." "I have a good teacher," she said, and was rewarded with what might have been the ghost of a smile. March arrived with a blizzard that lasted a week, trapping them inside once more. But this time, the silence felt different, companionable rather than oppressive. Boone taught her to play checkers with a set he'd carved years ago. She continued reading aloud, and sometimes he would add his own stories, tales from his trapping days, legends Jacob's people had shared, memories of his childhood in Missouri before the wanderlust took hold. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, he spoke about the day his family died. "I was out checking traps. Gone 3 days. When I came back, Mary was already burning with fever. Said it came on sudden like. I did everything: willow bark tea, cold compresses, every remedy I knew. Nothing helped. Lizzie went quick, mercy of God. Mary lingered another day, out of her head mostly. Last thing she said was my name." Sarah reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. He didn't pull away. "After I buried them, I meant to burn this place. Pack up, head further west, maybe California. But I couldn't. Everything they touched was here. So I stayed, and the staying turned me hard. Figured if I couldn't feel nothing, couldn't hurt like that again." "But you did feel," Sarah said softly. "That's why you needed an heir, to carry on what they started." He looked at her sharply. "That's what I told myself. But maybe—" He turned his hand palm up, fingers closing around hers. "Maybe a man gets tired of being stone." The moment stretched between them, fragile as spring ice. Then a log collapsed in the fire, breaking the spell, and he withdrew his hand, but something fundamental had changed. The real change came with an April thaw that arrived like a blessing. The snow began its slow retreat, revealing the damage winter had wrought: broken fences, torn roofing, depleted stores, but also revealing possibilities. As they worked side by side on repairs, Sarah caught Boone watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. One morning, she found him in the barn, standing over an open trunk she'd never seen before. Inside were women's clothes, Mary's clothes, preserved in cedar and lavender. "Thought you might could use these," he said gruffly. "No sense letting moths have them. Mary was practical, she'd want them used." Sarah lifted out a blue calico dress, sturdy and well-made. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He cleared his throat. "There's something else." From his pocket, he drew out a simple gold ring. Not Mary's wedding ring, she'd seen that in the box hidden in the loft. This was different, newer. "Had Jacob take it to town last fall, before I went to the auction. Didn't know who I'd be bringing back, but figured—" He stopped, started again. "What I'm trying to say is, you've earned the right to be called wife proper. Not because I bought you, because you stayed when you could have run, because you saved my worthless hide, because maybe this place don't have to be a prison for either of us." Sarah looked at the ring, then at him. This wasn't love, not like in her mother's romantic stories, but it was something: respect, partnership, the possibility of affection growing like the garden buried under snow. "Ask me," she said quietly. "Not as a man who bought property, as a man asking a woman." He took a deep breath. And she saw what the effort cost him, this man who'd armored himself in solitude and silence. "Sarah Ann O'Connell," he said formally. "Would you be my wife, real and true?" She thought of the bitter man who'd bought her at auction, claiming only heirs mattered, thought of the long, silent winter, the storms weathered, the work shared, thought of his hand in hers at the table, his trust as she tended his wounds, the way he'd said her name in his fever, not Mary's, but hers. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ezekiel, I will." Spring transformed the mountain valley with a swiftness that took Sarah's breath away. One day the world was locked in ice. The next, water ran everywhere, dripping from icicles, gurgling in freshets, turning the hard ground to mud. The sound of it was like music after months of snow-muffled silence. With the ring on her finger, simple but solid, like everything Ezekiel made, Sarah felt a subtle shift in how she moved through the world. She was no longer a purchased stranger in this place, but something more: partner, wife, keeper of the hearth. The change showed in small ways. Ezekiel began consulting her about plans for expansion, a larger chicken coop, terraced beds for the garden. He brought her the first wildflowers of spring, laying them wordlessly on the table with an expression somewhere between embarrassment and hope. Jacob Two Rivers returned with his family as soon as the passes cleared. His mother, a dignified woman named Singing Crow, took one look at Sarah and smiled knowingly. "You survived the winter," she said in careful English. "This is good. The mountain has accepted you." While the men worked on repairs, Singing Crow taught Sarah the properties of native plants, which roots could flavor stew, which leaves eased pain, which bark would help a fever. Her daughter, Little Fawn, a girl of perhaps 12, showed Sarah where the best berries grew and how to read the signs of coming weather in the behavior of birds. "Your man," Singing Crow said one day as they gathered camas bulbs. "He was like dead man walking after his woman died. We thought the mountain would claim him, but you brought him back to the living." "He's still—" Sarah searched for words. "Closed. Careful." A heart frozen takes time to thaw. Be patient. The spring comes when it comes. As the days lengthened, so did the list of work. Sarah threw herself into the garden with passion, expanding Mary's neat rows, trying new vegetables from seeds Jacob had brought from town. Ezekiel watched her work with something like wonder. "Never seen anyone take to the soil so natural-like," he said one evening, finding her dirt-smeared and happy, thinning carrots. "My mother had a garden," Sarah replied. Before things got hard. I'd forgotten how much I loved it, making things grow, creating something from nothing." "Not nothing," he corrected. "Seeds and soil and sweat, that's something." She looked up at him, silhouetted against the evening sky. "Yes," she agreed. "That's something." They developed new rhythms together. Morning coffee on the porch, watching mist rise from the valley. Working side by side, he taught her to split wood properly. She taught him the hymns she hummed while cooking. Evenings by the fire, her reading aloud or him telling stories from his years in the wilderness. One night, he surprised her with a question. "You ever think about writing to them, your folks?" Sarah's hands stilled on her mending. "Sometimes. But what would I say? That their daughter lives like a wild woman in the mountains? That the man who bought me for $40 turned out to be—" She paused, uncertain how to finish. "What?" His voice was carefully neutral. "Kind, in his way, decent, nothing like I feared." A long silence. Then, "You could tell them you're well, happy even, might ease their minds." "Are you happy?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He considered, gazing into the fire. "Getting there," he said finally. "Like spring comes slow, but it comes." In June, old Pete the trapper appeared, leading a pack mule and looking like something dragged backward through a hedge. He was full of news from the outside world: gold strikes in Colorado, troubles brewing back east over slavery, the railroad pushing ever westward. "Got mail for you? Boone." he said, producing a battered envelope. Lawyer fellow in Cedar Falls said to bring it up. Ezekiel's face went tight as he read. Sarah, serving coffee, caught the change in his expression. What is it? My brother, dead 6 months ago. Lawyer says there's property in Missouri, the family farm. Wants to know my intentions. Old Pete, sensing tension, made his excuses and bedded down in the barn. Sarah and Ezekiel sat in silence until she couldn't bear it. You're thinking of going back? No. The word came quick and firm. That life's dead to me, but, he rubbed his face, there might be things there, family things, pictures, maybe, of my parents. Then we should go, Sarah said simply. He looked at her sharply. Did you think I'd stay here alone after what happened in winter? She tried for lightness. Besides, I'd like to see this Missouri you've mentioned. Meet the place that made you. It's a long journey, weeks there and back. Then we'd better start planning. Something flickered across his face, gratitude, perhaps, or relief at not facing old ghosts alone. You sure you want to leave this place? You've worked so hard on the garden. The garden will be here when we return. Jacob can tend things. She reached across the table, taking his hand. It was becoming easier. These small touches. We're partners, remember, for better or worse. His fingers tightened around hers. I remember. They left in early July, taking the wagon and oxen, loading it with supplies for the journey. The mountains seemed to release them reluctantly. Rain delayed their start. A wheel broke just 10 miles out, requiring a full day's repair. But once they reached the plains, the traveling became easier. Sarah marveled at the vastness, the sweep of grass that seemed to go on forever. They camped under stars so bright they hurt to look at, woke to sunrises that painted the world gold. And something shifted between them on those long days of travel. Away from the weight of memory that haunted the cabin, Ezekiel seemed lighter. He pointed out landmarks, shared stories of his first journey west as a young man full of dreams and vinegar. At night, he taught her to find constellations, their shoulders touching as they lay on blankets looking up. One evening, camped by a clear stream, he pulled out a harmonica she didn't know he owned. Play something, she urged. Been a long time. But he lifted it to his lips, and a melody emerged sweet and sad and achingly beautiful. What is that? Something my mother used to sing. Shenandoah, I think it was called. Play it again. He did, and this time she hummed along, learning the tune. When he finished, she was surprised to see tears on his weathered cheeks. Ezekiel, just haven't played that since Lizzie died. She used to dance when I played, spin in circles till she got dizzy and fell down laughing. He wiped his face roughly. Didn't think I could bear the memories. But you did, Sarah said softly. You bore them and played anyway. Yeah, he said wonderingly. I did. That night, for the first time, he kissed her. Not the chaste pecks of duty, but something real tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. Sarah, I need you to know I'm trying, to be a proper husband, to give you what you deserve, but I'm out of practice at feeling things. I know, she whispered. We have time, all the time we need. They reached Missouri in late July, the humidity a shock after the mountain air. The family farm was smaller than Sarah had expected, run down but still standing. Neighbors had been renting the fields, keeping the place from complete ruin. Walking through the house where Ezekiel had grown up was like stepping into his past. Here was the kitchen where his mother had cooked, the room where he'd been born, the tree outside he'd fallen from and broken his arm, and in the attic, they found what he'd hoped for, a trunk of family belongings. There were photographs, letters, his mother's Bible, his father's watch. But what made Ezekiel's hands shake was a small item at the bottom, a carved wooden horse, worn smooth from handling. "I made this," he said quietly, "for my little brother. Fever took him when he was 4. After that, my parents, they never quite recovered. Think that's why I left when I did. Too many ghosts." Sarah understood then why he'd chosen the isolation of the mountains, why loss had driven him so deep into solitude. He'd been running from ghosts all his life, only to create more. They spent 3 days in Missouri, sorting through belongings, arranging for the farm's sale, visiting the graves of his parents and brother. Sarah stood beside him at the small cemetery, offering silent support as he made his peace with the past. On their last morning, as they loaded the wagon with the few mementos he'd chosen to keep, Ezekiel took her hands. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for understanding why I needed to, for—" he struggled for words, "for showing me I could face this without drowning in it." "We face things together now," she reminded him, "the good and the bad." "Together," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "I like the sound of that." The journey home was swifter, both eager to return to their mountain valley, when they finally crested the ridge that looked down on their clearing. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Home. When had this wild place become home? Jacob had tended things well. The garden flourished, the animals were healthy, the cabin stood solid and welcoming. That night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the meadow, Ezekiel reached for her hand. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said. Writing to your folks, if you want to, I mean." Sarah considered. So much had changed since that awful morning on the auction platform. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd been sold to a stranger. She was a woman of the mountains now, strong and capable, partner to a man who was learning, day by day, to open his heart again. "Yes," she said, "I think I'd like that. Tell them I'm well, that I'm happy." "Are you?" He asked the question she'd posed months ago. Happy? She thought of winter storms weathered together, of spring flowers on the table, of his hand in hers under Missouri stars, of the carved wooden horse now sitting on the mantel beside Mary's picture, not replacing the past, but joining it, making room for both sorrow and joy. "Yes," she said, meaning it. "I am." He lifted their joined hands, kissing her knuckles gently. "So am I," he said, and the wonder in his voice made her heart swell. "So am I." The judge arrived on a September morning when the aspens were just beginning to turn gold. Sarah was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables, when she heard horses approaching, too many horses for ordinary visitors. Her heart lurched as she recognized the lead rider, Judge William Thornberry from Cedar Falls, accompanied by 2 deputies and, most surprisingly, her father. Ezekiel emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but held low. His face had gone carefully blank. The expression Sarah knew meant he was prepared for trouble. "Judge Thornberry," he said evenly, "long way from town." The judge, a thin man with sharp eyes and graying whiskers, dismounted slowly. "Mr. Boone, Mrs. Boone." He tipped his hat to Sarah, though his expression suggested uncertainty about using that title. "I'm here on official business, I'm afraid." Sarah moved to stand beside Ezekiel, acutely aware of her dirt-stained dress, her work-roughened hands. Her father hadn't moved from his horse, couldn't seem to meet her eyes. "State your business, then," Ezekiel said. Thornberry produced a document from his coat. "There's been a petition filed concerning the validity of your arrangement. Questions have been raised about whether the transaction conducted last year constitutes a legal marriage under territorial law." "Who raised these questions?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew. "Your parents, Miss O'Connell. They've had a change in circumstances. Your mother's brother passed, left them a small inheritance. They wish to rectify what they see as a grave error." Now her father dismounted, finally looking at her. Patrick O'Connell seemed smaller than she remembered, worn down by guilt and frontier hardship. "Sarah, girl, we've come to take you home. What we did selling you like livestock, it wasn't right. Wasn't legal neither. The judge says." "I'm not sold livestock," Sarah said firmly. "I'm a married woman." "That's what we're here to determine." Judge Thornberry interjected. "The law is unclear on such arrangements. There was no proper ceremony, no license filed." "There was a bill of sale," Ezekiel said coldly. $40 paid in gold, witnessed and recorded. "Which is precisely the problem," the judge replied. "Marriage isn't a commercial transaction. A person cannot be bought and sold. The very existence of such a document may invalidate any claim to legal marriage." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "And if you determine our marriage invalid, what then?" "Then you're free to leave with your father. Return to your family. Your reputation intact, perhaps in time, with a proper courtship, a legitimate marriage." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Judge Thornberry, when my family sold me, yes, sold me. Let's not dress it up pretty. Where was the law then? Where were you when desperate families were auctioning their daughters on the street?" The judge shifted uncomfortably. "Irregular arrangements were made during the drought years. We're trying to correct those now." "You're trying to soothe guilty consciences." Sarah interrupted. "My parents took $40 and their freedom to California. They left me with a stranger and never looked back. Now they want to claim it wasn't legal." "Sarah," her father said plaintively, "we were desperate. Your mother cries every night thinking what we'd done to you when Brother William died and left us his savings. First thing we did was come back for you." "A year later," she said. "After winter storms that could have killed us both. After—" She stopped herself, unwilling to share the private struggles and triumphs of the past year with these intruders. Judge Thornberry cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside. I need to ask some questions. Determine the nature of your cohabitation." Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. "Come in then, but the rifles stay outside." The deputies looked to the judge, who nodded. They sat awkwardly around the table Sarah had scrubbed that morning, in the home she'd made comfortable through a year of hard work. She served coffee with steady hands, playing hostess even as they questioned the legitimacy of her life here. "Miss O'Connell," the judge began. "Mrs. Boone," she corrected. "That's what we're here to determine. Have you and Mr. Boone been living as man and wife in all respects?" Heat crept up Sarah's cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "Yes." "Under duress coercion?" "At first, perhaps, but not for many months now." "So you remain here of your own free will?" "I remain here because this is my home, because I choose to." Her father made a pained sound. "Sarah, you don't have to protect him. If he's hurt you, forced you." "The only force used was when you put me on that auction block," Sarah said quietly. "Ezekiel has never raised a hand to me, never forced anything. We've built a life together, a good life. Built on an illegal foundation." Judge Thornberry said, "The law is clear, a person cannot be sold. Therefore, the transaction was void. Without a legal marriage ceremony following, you are technically unmarried, merely cohabitating. Then we'll marry properly." Ezekiel spoke for the first time since they'd entered. "Today, you're a judge. You can perform the ceremony." "I could," Thornberry admitted. "But there's the question of consent. Given the irregular nature of how Miss O'Connell came to be here, I must be certain she consents freely, without coercion." "Then ask her," Ezekiel said simply. All eyes turned to Sarah. She could leave now. She realized, go with her father, return to civilization, pretend this year had never happened. The law would protect her. Call her a victim rather than a willing partner in this wilderness life. She thought of the bitter man who'd bought her, claiming only heirs mattered. But she also thought of the same man teaching her to read the weather, placing wildflowers on her table, playing harmonica under the stars. of winter nights when he'd trusted her with his grief, spring mornings when she'd seen him smile, of the gold ring on her finger that he'd bought before he ever met her, hoping for a true partnership. "Judge Thornberry," she said formally, "I need you to understand something. What happened in Cedar Falls was wrong, but what's happened since that's been right. I came here as property, I'll grant you that, but I stayed as a partner. I choose to stay now as a wife." "Sarah, please," her father begged. "Your mother—" "My mother let me go for $40. I forgive her. I forgive you both. Times were hard, but you don't get to reclaim me now like I'm a pawned pocket watch." She stood, moving to stand beside Ezekiel. "I've made my choice." The judge studied them both. "You're certain you understand you could leave freely? With no shame attached, the law would protect you." "The law didn't protect me when I needed it," Sarah said. "But that's past. What matters is now. I stand here of my own free will, asking you to perform a legal marriage ceremony between myself and Ezekiel Boone. Unless," she added with a touch of her mother's old spirit, "the law has some objection to that too." Judge Thornberry was silent for a long moment. Then he stood. "Patrick, I believe your daughter has made her position clear. The original transaction may have been irregular, but I see no current coercion. If both parties desire it, I'll perform the ceremony." Her father's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Sarah, girl." "I'll write to Mother," she said more gently. "Tell her I'm well, happy, that I forgive you both. But this is my life now." They were married there in the cabin, with her father and the deputies as witnesses. It was nothing like the church wedding she'd dreamed of as a girl. No white dress, no flowers, no joyful family celebration. But when Ezekiel took her hands and spoke his vows in his steady, certain voice, when he slipped the ring on her finger for the second time, Sarah felt more truly married than any ceremony could make her. Judge Thornberry produced the legal certificate. "This makes it official. Whatever irregular beginning you had, you're legally wed now. No one can challenge that." After they left, her father pressing a letter from her mother into her hands, tears on his weathered face. Sarah and Ezekiel stood on the porch watching the riders disappear down the trail. "You could have gone," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "I couldn't have—" He turned to her, searching her face. "Why really, why not what you told them, but the truth?" Sarah considered her words carefully. "Because somewhere between that awful day in Cedar Falls and now, I stopped being the girl they sold and became the woman I chose to be. Because this place, hard as it is, has become home. Because you—" She paused, gathering courage. "Because you've become home too." He pulled her against him then, holding her with a fierceness that said more than words could. They stood that way for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, breathing in the crisp autumn air that promised another winter coming. "No regrets?" he asked finally. "None," she said, and meant it. That night, as they lay together in the bed they now truly shared as husband and wife, Ezekiel spoke into the darkness. "I bought you for the wrong reasons. Thought I needed heirs, someone to work, someone who couldn't leave like everyone else had left. I was wrong." "What do you need now?" Sarah asked softly. "You," he said simply. "Just you. However, you'll have me." She turned in his arms, finding his face in the moonlight. "Then you have me, legal papers and all." "Sarah," he said, and her name on his lips was like a prayer. "Sarah, I think I love you. Don't know when it happened. Maybe when you saved my life in that blizzard. Maybe when you stood there today choosing this hard life when you could have had ease. Maybe it's been happening all along. So slow I didn't notice. But I do. Love you. I mean," tears pricked her eyes, "I love you too. Not the man who bought me, I don't think I even knew that man, but the one who taught me to survive, who trusted me with his grief, who plays harmonica under the stars. That man, I love with all my heart." They held each other close as the night deepened around them. Two souls who had found each other through the strangest of circumstances. Outside, an early snow began to fall, but inside the cabin was warm, filled with the quiet joy of love acknowledged, chosen, and finally, fully legal. The paper from town didn't make their marriage real that had happened somewhere in the daily work of survival, in the sharing of sorrows and small joys. But it meant the world would recognize what they already knew: they belonged to each other, not through purchase, but through choice, not through law, but through love. The first snow of their second winter together fell on a quiet November evening. Sarah stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down like blessings, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. Behind her, she could hear Ezekiel working the steady scrape of his knife as he carved something from a piece of pine. "What are you making?" she asked without turning. "A cradle," he said, and she could hear the wonder in his voice, the fear too. "Figured we'll need one come spring." She turned then, finding him surrounded by wood shavings, the beginning of a small cradle taking shape under his careful hands. The firelight caught the silver in his hair, the deep lines around his eyes, lines that now crinkled when he smiled, which happened more and more often these days. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "My father made one like this for my brother," he said quietly. "I remember watching him work on it, thinking someday I'd make one for my own child." His hand stilled. "Never thought I'd get another chance." Sarah moved behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," he admitted. "What if something goes wrong? We're so far from any doctor, any help." "Singing Crow will come when it's time." Sarah reminded him. "She's delivered dozens of babies, and we're stronger than we were, both of us." He covered her hands with his. "When did you get so wise?" "Somewhere between learning to shoot a rifle and mucking out the barn," she said lightly, but then grew serious. "We've faced worse than this. Ezekiel, we'll face this together too." The letter she was writing to her mother lay on the table, half finished. She'd been trying to find the words to explain the life she'd chosen, the happiness she'd found in this unlikely place. How did you tell someone that being sold at auction had led to love? That the mountains that had seemed like prison walls now felt like sheltering arms? Asterisk, dear mother. She had written, asterisk. I hope this letter finds you well in California. Your last letter spoke of orange groves and sunshine. How different from our mountain valley, where winter is already settling in. You asked if I am happy, if I forgive you. The answer to both is yes, completely and truly. Asterisk. The man you sold me to has become the man I would choose above all others. It was not easy at first. We were both too broken, too afraid to trust. But love, I have learned, can grow in the rockiest soil if tended carefully. And oh, mother, how it has grown. She would finish it tomorrow. Tell her mother about the baby coming, about the legal marriage that had confirmed what their hearts already knew. For now, she was content to watch her husband work, to feel the life growing within her, to listen to the peaceful silence of snow falling. A knock at the door broke the quiet, unusual for this time of year. Ezekiel reached for his rifle, then relaxed as a familiar voice called out, "It's Pete got news from town." Old Pete entered in a flurry of snow and tall tales, accepting coffee and a seat by the fire. But his usual jovial manner seemed forced, and Sarah noticed the way his eyes kept flicking between them. "Out with it," Ezekiel said. "You didn't trek up here in a snowstorm for the coffee." Pete sighed. "There's been talk in town. That judge, Thornberry, he's been making noise about your situation. Seems some folks think he was too hasty performing that ceremony. There's pressure to have it reviewed, maybe annulled." "On what grounds?" Sarah demanded. "We were both willing. He witnessed it himself." "On the grounds that you couldn't give true consent, being as you were bought and all. Some church folks got their dander up. saying it sets a bad precedent. Pete shifted uncomfortably. There's talk of sending federal marshals come spring to investigate proper-like. Ezekiel's face had gone hard, the old walls threatening to slam back into place. But Sarah reached for his hand, anchoring him. "Let them come," she said firmly. "What will they find? A married couple expecting a child, working their land, bothering no one. We have our papers. More importantly, we have the truth." "Sarah's right," Pete said, seeming relieved by her calm response. "Just thought you should know. Be prepared. Though between you and me—" He winked. "I think you two could convince anyone that what you got is real." After Pete left, promising to return with supplies before the deep winter set in, Ezekiel was quiet for a long time. Sarah continued her evening work mending, preparing tomorrow's bread, giving him space to process. Finally, he spoke. "We could leave. Head further west, Oregon maybe, or California. Start fresh where nobody knows how we began." Sarah looked up from her sewing. "Is that what you want?" He met her eyes. "I want you safe. You and the baby. That's all that matters." "Then we stay," she said simply. "This is our home. We've paid for it in sweat and tears and joy. I won't let anyone drive us from it." "They could take you from me," he said, the old fear creeping into his voice. "The law can't touch what we have." Sarah interrupted. "Oh, they might try. They might question and investigate and make our lives difficult for a time. But Ezekiel, look at me." She waited until his gray eyes met hers. "I am not going anywhere. Not because you bought me, not because papers say we're married, but because I choose you. Every day. I choose you. That's what I'll tell them if they come. That's what I'll keep telling them until they understand." He pulled her to him then, holding her as if she might vanish. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured into her hair. "Not luck," she corrected. "Work. We worked for this, both of us." That night, as the snow continued to fall, Ezekiel brought out something she'd never seen before, a small leather journal. "I started writing in this after Mary and Lizzie died," he explained. "Couldn't talk about the grief, so I wrote it down. Stopped when the words ran out." He opened it to a blank page. "Think maybe it's time to start again. Write about better things." "What will you write?" He thought for a moment, then began to speak as he wrote. November 15th, 1874. Snow falling. Sarah told me today we're staying to fight for our home. Bravest woman I ever met. Carrying our child and ready to face down federal marshals. He looked up. "That about right." "You could add that you love me," she suggested with a smile. "That goes without saying," he replied, but wrote it anyway. The winter passed peacefully despite the threat hanging over them. Sarah grew round with child. Ezekiel became ever more protective, and their love deepened with each passing day. When her time came in April, Singing Crow arrived as promised, bringing her daughter to help. The labor was long and difficult, testing Sarah's strength to its limits. But as dawn broke over the mountains, their son's cry filled the cabin strong and healthy and perfect. "What shall we name him?" Sarah asked, exhausted but radiant, the baby at her breast. Ezekiel touched his son's tiny fist with one finger, wonder written across his face. "Thomas," he said, "after my brother. If that's—" "It's perfect," Sarah agreed. "Thomas Patrick Boone, for both our families." A week later, the federal marshal arrived. Sarah was in the garden with the baby when the horses appeared. 3 men, all official-looking, badges glinting in the spring sun. Her heart hammered, but she stood calmly, Thomas secure in the sling across her chest. Mrs. Boone. The lead marshal, a man with kind eyes despite his stern demeanor, dismounted politely. "I'm Marshal James Carson. We're here to investigate claims regarding your marriage." "Then investigate," Sarah said. "Would you care for coffee while you do?" And so, in the same cabin where Judge Thornberry had questioned them. Sarah told her story again. This time, though, she held her son living proof of the life she and Ezekiel had built. The marshal listened, asked questions, took notes. He spoke with Ezekiel, examined their papers, even walked around their property. Finally, as afternoon shadows grew long, Marshal Carson put away his notebook. "Mrs. Boone, I've seen a lot in my years of service. I've seen false marriages and forced arrangements, women kept against their will. This isn't that." "No," Sarah agreed. "It's not. The folks who complained expected I'd find a victim here. Instead, I find a family." He stood, preparing to leave. "I'll file my report. There may be some who aren't satisfied, but the law is clear you're legally married, clearly consenting, and from what I can see, genuinely devoted to each other. That should be the end of it." As the marshals rode away, Ezekiel emerged from the barn where he'd been watching, ready to intervene if needed. He wrapped his arms around Sarah and Thomas, the three of them standing together in their dooryard. "Think it's really over?" he asked. "The questions, maybe, but our life together, that's just beginning." That evening, Sarah finished the letter to her mother she'd started months ago. Asterisk. "The man who bought me for $40 gave me something worth more than gold, a true partnership, a loving heart, a home in these beautiful, terrible mountains. We have a son now, named for the families we came from, raised in the family we've made." Asterisk. "You asked if I forgive you. I do. The path was hard, but it led me here, and I would walk it again to reach this destination. Be at peace. Mother, your daughter is loved, is happy, is home." She sealed the letter, to be sent with old Pete on his next trip to town. Then she joined her husband and son by the fire, taking up the journal where Ezekiel had been writing. The last entry was in his careful hand. Asterisk. "They came to question our marriage. Sarah stood tall as these mountains and twice as strong. Thomas slept through it all. We are a family. Let any man try to say otherwise." Below it, Sarah added her own words. Asterisk. "This is our truth, that love can grow from the stoniest ground, that hearts can heal, that sometimes the life we never asked for becomes the one we'd never trade. I was bought for $40. I stayed for love. I remain by choice." The journal would continue, filled with the ordinary miracles of their life, Thomas's first steps, successful harvests, winter storms weathered together. But this entry, Sarah thought, captured the heart of their story. Two broken people who found wholeness in each other, who built a life worth fighting for in a wilderness that tested them and made them strong. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, guardians of their hard-won happiness. Inside, a baby cooed, a fire crackled, and two people who had begun as strangers sat close together, writing the continuing story of their love. The ring on Sarah's finger caught the firelight, not Mary's ring gathering dust in a memory box, but her own, placed there by choice and kept there by devotion. She thought of that scared girl on the auction block, wondered if she could have imagined this moment. Perhaps not. But then, the best stories are often the ones we never saw coming. In the morning, there would be chores. There were always chores. But tonight, there was peace and love, and the quiet satisfaction of a battle won not with violence, but with truth. Their beginning might have been unorthodox, but their ending, no. Sarah corrected herself. Their continuing that was a choice they made every day, and they would keep choosing each other, through whatever seasons came. In their valley, where the mountains touched the sky, and love had grown from the most unlikely seed. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Sarah and Ezekiel's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier tales. And let me know your thoughts about this story. Did you expect their love to bloom from such a harsh beginning? Your comments and shares mean the world to us. Until the next time, partners.